Good afternoon. I'm the warm-up for this presentation, but I wanted to do a few thank yous before we got started. First of all, this is our last day at the Dock Street, and they've been wonderful hosts, so I want to have a warm applause for the entire staff of the Dock Street Theater. And also, we wouldn't have a festival without our amazing staff, and I want to bring Suzanne Pollock in particular out to say a few words. Suzanne has probably picked most of your pockets for the past year or so, but she's emblematic of the quality of the people we have here. So I want to thank the entire staff, but because Suzanne has a relationship with our next speaker, I thought it'd be appropriate for her to make a few remarks before the introductions were made. So Suzanne?
Thank you, Walter. Walter usually calls me every morning and says, "What have you raised today?" So I'm the development director of the Literary Festival and the chief party planner, and it's super fun. And I'm up here to give a little directions to please turn off your phones, put them away, and please go in the lobby and buy our fabulous merchandise. We have great stuff. And I also want to thank our sponsors, 20 South Battery and Jack Schaefer. Thank you. And if you would like to come see me about how to support the festival, I would love to go for a walk with you. The reason why I'm up here also is because two of my very close friends you're going to be hearing from, and one is Jim Stewart and the other is Autumn Phillips. Autumn is like a younger sister to me. I love her. And Jim has been one of my husband's closest friends since they met the first day in law school 50 years ago. So the person who's going to do the proper introduction is Wenda Millard, is our board chair. No, she's not the chair, she's the vice chair. Wenda Millard. Thank you.
As one writer puts it, the first rule of media industry scandals is that however ugly they appear from the outside, it's actually much worse on the inside. I will personally confirm that as true. I served as a media executive for many, many years and had a front row seat to its machinations. I ate this book for breakfast, lunch, and dinner and snacked on it at midnight. I could not put it down. If you haven't read it yet, I know you will join us in devouring it with delight. If you have read it, you know what I'm talking about. James B. Stewart won a 1988 Pulitzer Prize for journalism and has won 5 Gerald Loeb Awards, a George Polk Award for journalism, an Edgar Allan Poe Award, and many others for his exquisite business writing. He's a regular contributor to The New Yorker, The New York Times, and Smart Money. Jim Stewart has been thrilling readers with nail-biting, edge-of-our-seats, true tales of larger-than-life business and public figures, from Michael Milken in Den of Thieves to Michael Eisner in Disney War and Bill Clinton in Bloodsport. Unscripted is his 11th book. It is an account of media titan Sumner Redstone's final years presiding over the CBS, Viacom, Paramount, National Amusements, and Simon and Schuster empire. Says The New Yorker, it is a chronicle of corporate greed, manipulation, misogyny, and sexual impropriety on a spectacular scale, a model of how to gracefully tell the most grotesque of stories. Ed Kozner in the Wall Street Journal wrote, Sumner Redstone, who died in 2020 at the age of 97, was one of the killer whales thriving in the swirling currents of the modern media. A hulking old man with dyed red hair and a maimed right hand. He was a mega-billionaire with a ravenous appetite for power, riches, and sex. Esquire called Unscripted the sordid family saga that makes Succession look tame. But Kirkus Reviews said that to call it sordid is to undervalue the word. Unscripted reads for long stretches like a filthy pulp novel, writes Matthew Bologna in the Washington Post. There's the 90-something billionaire with still active sexual appetites, the scheming mistresses, threesomes, parked car encounters, a Sedona love nest, a chief executive who allegedly forced himself on multiple victims, a stolen laptop, shady private investigators, and a cast of characters straight off MTV or another Redstone cable channel. There is no question that this book is entertaining, but it is not Succession, nor any other fictionalized representation of wealth and power. It is a real story, meticulously researched and brilliantly written, that will make you think hard about why we so often celebrate or give undue consideration to the rich and powerful. It will make you think about how money distorts reality, creating toxic corporate environments and ruining good people's lives. Unscripted will make you think. It will also make you blush. Our interlocutor for this session is Autumn Phillips, who many of you know. She is executive editor of Charleston Post and Courier, where she has overseen major initiatives such as Rising Waters, the climate change series named a Pulitzer Prize finalist this year. And now, we proudly welcome Jim Stewart and Autumn Phillips.
All right, that set the stage. So the fun thing about being an interlocutor at this festival is you're not just reading the book, you're reading the author and trying to figure out what makes Jim Stewart tick, why does he write? And we're going to dive into a lot of salacious details, but what makes Jim a great writer, he's a great investigative reporter, but also a great writer, is because his empathy, his observation of humans, of their interaction with each other, what motivates them. So I just want to read something. So he wrote this great book called Follow the Story, which is about how to be a journalist. And here's what he says. When stories are well told and readers absorb what they read as though they were experiencing the events themselves, the stories engage the emotions as well as the mind. I find there is only one achievement greater than making readers laugh, and that is making them cry. I have discovered and tried to convey courage and integrity in the face of hardship and adversity in almost every story I've written. In ways large and small, what is noble about the human spirit emerges frequently and often in unlikely places. So I just wanted to set that stage, that background behind all this, other salacious details. So let's talk a little bit about how this book came to be, how it went from, being an article or series of articles to being a book, and then how it went from being one author to two authors.
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me. I love Charleston, partly because I love old houses, so this is like heaven for me. Thank you for that unbelievably good introduction. I think maybe the best one I've ever gotten anywhere. And thank you, Autumn, for that very perceptive comment from my book. To just address that briefly, yes, there are a lot of, I guess you would say salacious details in this book. And by the way, I did leave some things out. So my 11-year-old niece a great niece wanted to read it, and her parents said, no, it's the only one of my books they've had to say, no, you're not old enough to read that yet. But, the comment says, the kind of the courage, the fortitude, the sensitivity, the nobleness of the human spirit that emerges, you often find in the worst of circumstances, whether that's the terrorist attacks of September 11th, or in this case, a very dysfunctional family and in a very corrupt, environment, driven by greed, money, power. So that the main character, Sherry Redstone, is, in a way, I think, kind of the hero of the story. As she, had if you read the book, you'd see, an incredibly difficult father, an incredibly difficult upbringing, and then as a woman executive in a world dominated by rich and powerful men, has to surmount one hurdle after another, and that kind of drives the saga. But I kind of backed into this. I mean, I began covering this while writing columns and articles in the New York Times after Les Moonves was forced out at CBS for well-publicized sexual harassment, initially revealed in The New Yorker by Ronan Farrow. And I learned there that there was a big story behind that. It wasn't really what you thought. Believe it or not, the CBS board was relatively untroubled by the incidents in The New Yorker, but there were other issues that had come up. So I started working on that. And because there was a big board involvement, I realized there was a lot more to the story than we could tell in the article. So I initially conceived of this as more of a corporate boardroom story. So my co-author, Rachel, who you would love, she's great, she came into the story because an anonymous source came to the New York Times. Rachel had been working in Me Too stories. She helped write the Harvey Weinstein articles, and they just referred this tip, it came in there, to her. She followed it up. It turned out to be a then confidential source who shared with Rachel, and in turn with me, a trove of internal documents that were amassed by a law firm that was investigating the Moonves thing. Now that source has gone public. She has emerged. She gave an interview to the New York Times, the daily interview, and she talked about why she did that and the consequences. She was a lawyer working on the internal investigation. Her motivation was that she feared all this information would be gathered, an internal report would be prepared, the board would do nothing, they would sweep it under the rug, but they could say, oh, we hired an outside law firm, they did the report, we read it, but we aren't really going to do anything. And she didn't want to see that happen. So the lawyers in the audience will realize that she brazenly broke the attorney-client privilege in doing that. And she ended up paying a price by being disbarred. But that's a whole other story. So that was the genesis of all this information. And I recognized immediately that we could tell a corporate story that I'd never been able to tell because this is all confidential material. So that was the beginning. But as we started working, it became less the corporate story, really less about Les Moonves and more the family drama that I think finally emerges here.
Yeah. Well, let's start with Sherry Redstone. So, reading a lot about your other writing, you seem to be driven by an interest in, parent-child relationships, in a father-son, a mother-son, and in this case, a father-daughter. So what is it about that theme that you think makes an interesting story? And tell us a little bit about that father-daughter relationship.
Well, there's no question that that family dynamics do interest me from a storytelling standpoint. I hasten to say I'm not a psychologist, and I have no particular expertise in that field. Sometimes, I kind of wish I was, but I think a lot of good writers have not been, and yet they explore these relationships. I mean, the family relationship is primal for all of us. It's the first thing we experience as children and as we grow up. I mean, these our parents and our siblings, and those relationships, I think, loom large in everyone's life. They certainly have loomed large in my life. I gave a commencement speech a few years ago at my alma mater, DePaul University in Indiana, and I don't know really what took over me, but I decided I don't want to give the same boring talk. And for the only time, and that before or since, I addressed my complicated but very loving relationship with my father, and I talked about that. So yes, it's been a very personal thing to me and something that I see reflected in many people's lives. There's no, from the beginning of English literature, Shakespeare, so much of this is about the dynamics of the family and the way people take those dynamics and then in one way or another, they manifest themselves in their relationships with other people. Anyone who ever went to therapy has been, immediately, they say, well, tell me about your parents. So yes, I think those dynamics are the beginnings of many, many, many good stories. And you have to understand those dynamics. And this one in particular, it was the subject of fathers and daughters, I think, is somewhat neglected, certainly in the nonfiction world. And I'd never had a female protagonist in one of my books before. Again, writing mostly about legal, political, business subjects. Naturally, it was men dominated the cast of characters. So here was a woman, a daughter of a very powerful and exceptionally difficult parent, who was suddenly, because of her father's behavior and failing health, was thrust into something that she never sought. This is, again, when I say you find these stories in kind of unlikely places, it wasn't like Sherry Redstone grew up and said, someday I'm going to take over this empire and run it. Absolutely not. She cared about her family, she cared about her philanthropic ventures, her venture capital thing, but she was forced into this, and she found inside of her the resources to rise to this challenge. And so people say, oh, this is about bad behavior, it's terrible. No, I think this is an inspiring story at its heart. And that's what then, drew me deep into her saga.
Yeah. So her father, I mean, now she's, probably one of the most powerful people in Hollywood. But as you're reading this book, you find yourself feeling, it's gut-wrenching. You feel terrible. It's raw, it's sad. He is horrible to her. He abuses her in public. Do you want to talk a little bit about how he treated her and then how she responded? It felt like I think she continued to love him to the end.
Yes, again, talking about this father-daughter, relationship. The stereotype is, let's face it, father of the bride.
Yeah.
This is not father of the bride.
Yeah.
That little happy picture never surfaces here. And first of all, he drove away his son completely. The son couldn't take it, bailed out, cashed out his share, disappeared to a ranch in Colorado, did not show up at his father's funeral. So he left the picture entirely. That left only his daughter to focus on. And what I found so surprising about their relationship was how competitive he made it. And by the way, this is something, I don't think people like to talk about it, but that dynamic in a parent-child relationship, I think, is A, pretty common, and B, can be very damaging. And every time she started to do well on her own, he would find a way of pulling the rug out from under her. And even if it was something like a card game, if he was losing, he'd change the rules. Or if she beat him at tennis, he flew into a rage. It went down to the most trivial aspects of that. And yet at the same time, sometimes he would publicly say how proud he was of her, how well she was doing, and then he'd turn around with a flurry of emails to board members and key people and say the most scathing things about her. And by the way, she was right about love. He insisted on buying the Blockbuster, film rental thing. Well, that was a dinosaur. She opposed that. He bought this video game company, and that collapsed. She was opposed to that. And that's what really drove them apart, when she defied him on that. But she was right. He never gave her credit for anything like that. So that very difficult dynamic. But I don't know that I can explain this. I think being a daughter maybe would make it more clear, but she never stopped loving him. And that was entwined with her desire for his approval. Yeah. She wanted his love. I talk about, it's great to make somebody laugh, which is quite hard, or making someone cry, but at the very end of the book, he dies, and she calls his closest and oldest friend and says, "Do you think he loved me?" And that really nearly makes me cry right now, that after all was said and done, and he now has died, she doesn't know the answer to that question, which means she'll never know it. And that, my heart goes out to her over that, really, to any child who, at the end of their parent's life, is still asking that question.
See what I mean? Let's back up a little bit and talk about the reporting, and then we'll jump back in and talk about some of the other personalities in this book. So in order to get this, I can't even imagine how many boxes, what is it, boxes, USB, what, I mean, I don't know what it was.
Well, fortunately,
Emails,
a lot of it is now in the cloud.
Yeah. So how much did you get? How did you get it? What did you get? And how did you sort through all of it?
Well, we did get a ton of stuff. First of all, the source, our lawyer, handed over virtually everything that they collected, which included emails, texts, memos, interview notes, deposition notes.
Yeah.
And by the way, as a reporter, I can say texts and emails are God's gift to journalism. And amazingly, people keep writing them.
Yeah.
You know, I shouldn't say
It's
this,
shocking.
but hasn't anybody figured out yet that these things end up surfacing in some kind of public context? So we had all that, and there's a lot of those quoted in there. And I love that as a writer because it's not somebody remembering or whether you are there as they're like tapping out whatever they're saying. So there was that trove. Then there were sources. A lot of material was produced in lawsuits against CBS, particularly in Delaware. And then, as often happens, lawyers in the room will know, they settle the case and then they seal everything, which as a journalist makes me mad because courts are supposed to be public proceedings. So they sealed it all. But fortunately, there are people with access to those documents who happen to agree with me, and they handed over a lot of the material that was produced there. So we got another load of, again, emails, especially the ones from Moonves to the board and some pivotal moments. And then, of course, there's, what do they say in the CIA? There's human intelligence and persuading people to talk. And the greatest, I tell my students this all the time, that the best way to get somebody to talk is not to just go knock on their door and say, okay, tell me what happened. It's to call them and say, okay, I understand that you said this at this date and then said that and they did this. In other words, you suggest you already know the story. Now, I shouldn't give away this little trick, but if some reporter calls you like that, amazingly, I'll say, okay, I know you met with Moonves on May 13th, 2010. They then suddenly assume you know everything. Like, oh my God, if they know that, they must know everything. So then they want to get their version out. So they know it's going to be in there. That is a very powerful tool to get a reluctant source to testify. And then, of course, there are people who all they need is the slightest little nudge, and they start talking and talking and talking. I tell my students, the art of listening is underappreciated in our society. Everybody's talking all the time. People are at dinner, they're all talking the same, then TV's on in the background, the kid is tick-tocking or whatever that is. And nobody is listening. And listening is so flattering. I tell my students, most of them are single, I said, you're on a date, try listening to the person who's talking to you as opposed to going on and on about your latest accomplishment or something like that. It works brilliantly, and people want to be heard. So they start talking and they keep talking. And the great example in this book is the opening scene, the first character, this guy named George Pilgrim, who I'd never heard of, I knew nothing about, is not a household name. He started talking. He could not stop talking. And he saved every photograph, every email, every text. He was a pack rat. And again, he turned out to be just a fantastic source.
So, well, let's talk about him. So, I read the whole book, and then later I was like, oh, how did he start this? And I went back, and the scene opens with George Pilgrim, a struggling actor, looking at the trade magazines.
Right.
Why did you start there?
Okay, that's a good question. By background, let me tell you that when George started, my co-author Rachel reached out to George. I was a little nervous about that because I knew he would proposition her within 10 minutes, which he did. But she said, no, I can handle this. I'll take care of him. And he was like a lamb after. Once she rebuffed him, he was fine. But she went out to see him over Memorial Day weekend. I said, Rachel, I want to hear from you every 2 or 3 hours and make sure you're okay. So he talked and talked. He gave us all this stuff. Rachel was breathlessly calling me, saying one great story after another. And I was mildly annoyed. I'd already written 100 pages, focusing on this corporate intrigue. And I was thinking, this guy George, he's taking over the story. And I went to bed. I woke up the next morning. I said, let George take over the story, because he is the beginning of the story. It finally occurred to me, and again, I always tell my students, but it's hard to live it, don't have any preconceived ideas about what the story is until you know the facts. So George surfaced. The reason George starts, he has an affair with one of Sumner Redstone's mistresses. And he had two mistresses living in the house with him. And they were plotting to take over the whole empire, CBS, Viacom, it all. And they were well on their way, believe me. And so in the middle of this, in the opening scene, George reads something about Sydney Holland, one of the mistresses. He claims that he saw her picture and thought she was really beautiful, and he texted her. She ignores it. He texts again. She ignores it. He makes a comment about a certain part of his anatomy, which I will not repeat here, and she answered. And that was the beginning of the end. That really is the beginning of the whole saga. So I often, again, tell my students, if you don't know where else to start a story, start in the beginning. It's so obvious, but it's not that easy. What was kind of risky about this is, so I have an opening scene. George and Sydney get together at the pool by the Peninsula Hotel. Kind of a cliche when you think about it, but nobody's heard of George Pilgrim and nobody's heard of Sydney Holland. So you want to write a book that's going to appeal to a lot of people, and you start with two characters nobody's heard of. But in my thinking about beginnings, the beginnings to me have only one purpose: make you read the next page. Pique your curiosity. Don't answer it. Everybody, by the time you've seen the cover, you know this is a book about a big media empire in the Redstones. So you plant these two characters no one's ever heard of, but they are interesting. And all I want to have happen is for people to think, whoa, who are these people? What do they have to do with the story? And I better read the next chapter to see what this has to do with it. And it is a cliffhanger in a sense. You know something's happening. They have this supposedly, kind of immediate electricity, as George put it, and you wonder, okay, this is not going to end well.
Okay, so he gives you all his text messages,
Pictures.
and emails, and pictures. This book, to me, it almost felt like, in some ways, I mean, it's one book, but it felt like two books, where there's this first drama with the mistresses, and they're, they are, cannibalizing this man at the end of his life, and then there's this other thing that's happening in the boardroom, the Les Moonves getting, Me Too'd and having his career end. How do those two things tie together?
Well, I really saw it as kind of three acts.
Yeah, okay.
So Act One, Sherry Redstone, she's drawn back into the drama because of these women. Yeah. The women are taking over his father's life and, among other things, freezing her out. That's part of the plan. So she and her children are trying to save their father from the mistresses. Right. So that's drama number one. She has to get the mistresses out of there, and because, like I said, they came really close to taking over the whole empire. And you'll see if you've read the book, they did walk out of there with $175 million between the two of them. I'll let you ponder that for a moment. But then Act Two, so the mistresses are out. Act Two is she had a hostile CEO and board at half the empire, which was Viacom. That's Paramount Studios, MTV, the cable channels, Comedy Central, all of that, in Philippe Domont. So she had to then tackle him. And she thought her ally in all of this was Les Moonves. Les Moonves was her friend. And she finally surmounts that. That's Act Two in my mind. And then Act Three, she thinks Moonves is her friend, but he launches this coup to remove her voting control and seize control of the CBS half of the empire. And it only really failed in the end because the Me Too movement rose up and he was flagrantly, caught in the middle of all that. And one of the mysteries to me, again, it goes to the issue really of human nature, is knowing as he did. So part of the intriguing part of Act Three is there's this sort of like down and out Hollywood manager whose client was assaulted by him many years ago. So he had the goods on him. And he is essentially blackmailing Moonves while this is all unfolding. So here you are, Moonves, you're CEO of CBS. The board is saying, let's mount this coup to unseat Sherry, strip her of voting control, seize control of the company, have public litigation over this. At the very same time, you are being blackmailed over a Me Too incident, which you know happened. Who in their right mind would launch a highly publicized front page attempt to seize control knowing that that was there? I cannot answer that question. But the texts are in there where you see, I mean, there's some bad people in here, but there are times when I felt sorry for them. And here's Moonves is tapping out these texts. He's drinking, and he's tapping out these increasingly deranged texts where he clearly knows that he's walking the plank and about to commit corporate suicide. And it's just this incredibly vivid picture of a guy melting under this pressure, which, again, I'm just the writer, but I did have the raw material to bring that to life, which I've never had before and probably never will again. But so that's kind of Act 3. And then ultimately what's left is the core relationship between, so she wins. My editor asked the same question that you did, to tell you the truth. I said, okay, I think of it as Lord of the Rings. Okay, Frodo meets this monster, vanquishes the monster. Then he crosses a river, there's another monster. He stabs that one. He crosses another mountain, and there's some other battle to fight. So here Sherry's at the end, and the last mountain to climb is the relationship with her father.
Yeah.
And that's where the book ends.
So let's go back to this. His name was Marv Dower, is that right?
Marv Dower, yes, the manager.
Yeah, so he's the manager. He sees this opportunity to basically blackmail a very powerful man and maybe get some, work for his clients. And how long were they texting? I mean, months.
Like a year and a half.
Oh, a year and a half. So they're texting for a year and a half. You have all these text messages, amazingly. And to me, he's saying, every time he gets a call from, or maybe gets a call from the New York Times or Time Magazine, he alerts Les Moonves that he got that, and don't worry, I won't speak, and I have your back, I'm your friend, and they're sort of manipulating each other. What it made me think about is how vulnerable power makes you. I mean, he made himself vulnerable by being, a bad person. But and then also we see it in the bedroom of a man as he's in his 90s and these two women. Was that a theme for you?
Yes. I mean, the broad theme here is when you have power and money, especially when you have a lot of power and money. Yeah. How does that affect the dynamic of the world in which you live and the people around you? And one thing that's perfectly clear in this story is that once you have enough of that, other people are trying to get it. Yeah. They want the power, they want the money, and they are going to find a way of insinuating themselves in there, getting their hands on it. And for better or worse, I'm not in that position, so I don't know quite what that feels like, but I've done many billionaires, and who can you trust? Right. I mean, I always thought, Sumner Redstone's a billionaire. He must have the best lawyers. He must have the best doctors, the best caregivers. Something happens in that dynamic where they don't think of him. He's not the first person they think of, because their interests are get some of that money, get some of that power. So here you have the Marv story, which I found extremely fascinating. He has leverage because he knows this. So he's trying to get work for his clients at CBS. And you can see Moonves knows that's wrong. He shouldn't give in to it. But slowly but surely, he goes down that path. He gets the audition. And then they say, no, you don't have to do the audition. And the clients, he finally gets a job offer from one of his clients. But this reminds me, we were talking about earlier about the telling detail. So Marv is from this small town in Minnesota. He came to Hollywood. He's like out there, you've never heard of him, but there's a whole substrata of these agents, managers, you know, they play golf, you know, they have some B-list actors, but they're never quite at the top of the thing. And so he invites Moonves to his 75th birthday party. And Moonves shows up, you know, and it's like, oh my God, he's back. Marv is back. He got the head of CBS to come. Can you believe that? But anyway, so he's from this small town in Minnesota, which was the birthplace of Spam, the canned meat. So among the many blandishments that he hung out in front of Moonves is he said, I'm bringing you and your son, Charlie, each a Spam T-shirt. And, you know, of course, you can imagine what Moonves thought about that. So anyway, the whole saga goes on. Anyway, it all blows up, and, you know, Moonves gets ousted. But Marv, he brought the T-shirts back, and he told Moonves that he had them, and Moonves ignored him. And again, okay, the guy's been blackmailing me. He's desperately trying to get work for his clients and stuff like that. And yet I still felt so bad for him. I was thinking, couldn't you just take the T-shirts, you know? Because he'd been pretending all this time to be his great friend, and then, you know, all of a sudden, no. He didn't care about the Spam T-shirts. But again, this was such a window into that kind of slight underbelly of Hollywood that we never really see. But there's a whole food chain out there, you know. It's not just the big stars and directors and stuff, but there's this whole like kind of middle management area of people who are kind of barely making ends meet, but are still kind of in the glamour and want to be and constantly trying to see, can I get this star to my birthday party? I thought, poor Marv, he was 75 years old, and you know, I think Jimmy Woods was the best he could do other than Moonves. He wasn't getting, you know, Barbra Streisand to come to this.
So we talked about this a little bit last night. You spent 3 years on this book, and a lot of that time was during the pandemic.
Yes, that's
right?
true.
So you're spending all day long at home, you know, bathing in this world.
Yeah,
what did that do
marinating.
to your worldview?
Well, look, a lot of people have said, don't you get depressed writing the books that you do? And the answer is no. I said, because like I said, there is, in the worst of stories, there are people who like draw the line and say, no, wait a minute, this is not right, this is wrong, I'm going to do something about this. And you know, I find that very, very inspiring. I'm sure many of the authors who've been here this week were writing these books in the pandemic. And in a way, when you do the writing phase, you kind of withdraw into your own world. Yeah, honestly, I think writers are difficult to live with in this period because they go into their own world, and they can't be counted on to like pay the electric bill or, you know, kind of the basic things of life. But in normal times, you disappear for 6 to 8 hours and you work in your own world, and then you like surface and you're like, oh, let's go have a drink, or let's have dinner with somebody, let's go to the movies, let's do something, let's see people. You have actual interaction. I live in a 2-story apartment, and at the end of the 6 to 8 hours, I just went upstairs. You know, that was the extent of it. So it was lonely sometimes. I guess some writers are very, you know, introverted or whatever. But I like getting out and seeing people interacting. So it's good I had Rachel because, you know, we'd mostly on the phone, but we'd talk every day. And Cheryl, can you believe this? Or I just found that, and that was very gratifying. But no, there were days it was kind of hard to face that blank screen in my pajamas or whatever.
This is probably an obvious question, but why do you think we like to read about rich people's lives falling apart?
Well, you know, we were talking too that like the famous opening line of Anna Karenina is that all happy families are the same, but all unhappy families are unique or their own story, something like that. I think it's true of miserable billionaires. It's the happy billionaire is not all that interesting, but the juxtaposition of great wealth and often great power that goes with it, which, you know, we're kind of groomed to feel, oh, this is the holy grail here, you know, we should want it, we should aspire to it, we should pursue it, against the fact that somebody is obviously miserable it inherently raises the question, well, how could that be? Wait, I thought that wasn't supposed to be like that. Why? What happened there? What went wrong? I mean, so there's an element of curiosity. Some people fault the press, like, an affluent Columbia student gets murdered, and it's front page New York Times story. A drug dealer on the corner of, 128th Street gets murdered, doesn't make the paper. So why is that? Well, it's because you don't expect a affluent, prosperous, young Columbia student to be murdered. A drug dealer gets murdered, it's not that big of a mystery about why it happened. So that it triggers this curiosity, and that, I think, is what drives a lot of what people read and what a lot of people end up writing. So yes, I'm always curious to know, there's the old saying that money doesn't buy happiness. It doesn't necessarily buy happiness, I would say. I think actually sometimes it does buy happiness, but seeing how that actually plays out, I think we can learn a lot. And let's face it, most of us are not going to be billionaires. And it is kind of reassuring to know that, even if I was a billionaire, maybe it wouldn't be all that great.
So, we're laughing at all of these sordid details of these lives, but when you really think about it, these were the people, controlling CBS, Comedy Central, Nickelodeon, MTV, our zeitgeist, our entertainment, the things that we do in the evenings and the things we talk about and the shapes our world. So why does it, I guess I'm answering my own question, but that's why it matters.
Well, yes, it does matter for that reason. And again, I think what you saw when the Me Too issue started, and the CBS board, which had Sherry Redstone, it had two other women, but they were kind of marginalized. It was the long-serving, older male members of the board who really controlled what was going on. They were Les Moonves's allies. And the reactions is truly astonishing. And we know the reactions because we got the text and we got the minutes of the comments. But, like a director said, when the New Yorker articles came in, there were 12 women said they had been assaulted or various forms of that by Les Moonves. And he said, I don't care if 100 women, come forward. We don't care about that. Les is our leader and we're standing behind him. Or another one who said, oh, well, we all did that,
Yeah.
These were just routine comments in the boardroom. And again, this is the mindset of people who were determining, greenlighting, deciding what's going to get made, what people are going to see. And there has been criticism of the media in recent years, particularly, that it had a very narrow view of a patriarchic, white, affluent view of American life. And only now is that starting to, open up somewhat. And you can see with, these are the people controlling it. Of course that was what the view was.
Before we go on to talk about a little bit more about your reporting, I want to, we were talking earlier about telling details and how important that is to carrying a reader through a story. And we were talking about your ending. Your beginning,
Right.
George Pilgrim, it's important where a book starts or where a story starts, but it's just as important where it ends. I was wondering if I could get you to read a scene where we have just read almost 300 pages of Sherry Redstone being abused by her father publicly and by her colleagues. But here she is at her father's funeral.
So they're now at the graveyard just outside of Boston. The gathering was so intimate, Sherry felt no need to restrain her emotions. She knelt so close to the grave, her children worried she might fall in. Between bouts of crying, she told her father everything she'd ever wanted to say to him. Finally, she stopped. Is there anything else, she asked? Her daughter reminded her that Sumner had asked that Frank Sinatra's recording of My Way be played at his funeral. Sherry had always cringed on the many occasions Sumner had insisted on listening to it. But now she asked Kim to pull up the lyrics on her phone. Sherry began singing. And now the end is here, and so I face that final curtain. She struggled through the 5 verses, each ending with the refrain, I did it my way.
So, what's interesting to me is, that's great writing. It's a powerful scene, it's a powerful ending, it's a story well told. But it's business journalism. You've dedicated your life to business journalism, the Wall Street Journal, Smart Money, now with your New York Times column, and with your books. What is it about business journalism that's important or that makes for great literature?
Good question. Well, to me, business journalism is just human journalism. I don't think I ever thought I want to be a business journalist. But I went to law school and I worked at a big corporate law firm. I saw business from the inside. Law school and working at the big law firm were great educations. And I knew that what I saw was a lot different from what I ever read in the press.
Yeah.
And then because of that, I started working in the sort of legal business area, and there were all these great stories and these fascinating people. And the world of business economics, money is a huge driving force in human motivation and what goes on in society and affects people's lives. And then there are these fascinating characters on the stage, and there weren't a lot of people, doing the kind of work I do in the business field. They were all interested in the numbers and what were the earnings last month and what do the analysts say about that. But I always zeroed in on the human story. We talked about earlier, one of my very first front page stories at the Wall Street Journal, I'd started on the legal beat, then I moved to mergers and acquisitions because I'd done a lot of work on that as a lawyer. And nobody else wanted to do it because the deals broke on Sunday and they didn't want to work on Sunday night. At the big law firm, I was always working on Sunday nights, so I was happy with that. Anyway, so this 2 boring companies, Rockwell International and Allen Bradley, were merging, and Allen Bradley was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It was a multi-billion-dollar deal, but no one heard of Allen Bradley. They said, go to Milwaukee and write a story about this. So I did, landed in Milwaukee, never been there. And as I got to know the story, I learned all these interesting facts. Like if anyone's been to Milwaukee, for a long time, the tallest thing there was a clock tower at the Allen Bradley factory. And Mr. Bradley, who was the head of the family that owned it and was the chairman and CEO, lived in the clock tower alone. He was a bachelor, as they said in those days, and he had a pet poodle. So he had a pet poodle, and he was an insomniac, and he would go walk on the factory floor at night with the poodle, and he knew every factory worker on the night shift because he'd walk along and he'd stop and he'd talk to them and see, like, how's your family, whatever. Allen Bradley had their own symphony orchestra. They had their own chorus. They toured Europe every year. They gave free concerts in Milwaukee. Okay, all of this was going. Rockwell International was not going to have a symphony orchestra. So anyway, I came back, and I wrote the story about the poodle at the beginning. Again, the telling detail. And I'll tell you what that said to me anyway. But anyway, I wrote the poodle in the very first paragraph. I turned it in, and my new editor called me in. I sat down in his office. We typed it on paper in those days. He held the story, glared at me. He stood up, he threw the pages on the floor, and he started jumping up and down on them. And he said, I don't know what this story is about. I said, oh, this is not getting off to a good start. Yeah. And he said, I'm sending you to the remedial writing coach. And by the way, the remedial writing coach was stage 1 on your exit from the newspaper. So I thought, oh, okay, well, whatever. So I went down. Ellen Graham, I remember this day, fantastic editor, and she said, I love this, and we're sending it straight to page 1. And after that, it was like he'd look at me like, look, I don't understand you, but you're doing something, so, okay, you can do whatever you want. But anyway, obviously, the reason the poodle was in the first paragraph was it embodied a world that was going to disappear. The new CEO was not going to be walking his dog on the factory floor. He wouldn't know the names of any of these people or care. Yeah. It was the end of an era. And that, to me, was the essence of this story, the demise of the patriarchal, family-owned company. And that to me was way more important than who is going to be making so much money on the next tool and die. I honestly don't even know what it is.
Do you have any updates about the characters in this book? Where are they now?
Not much has happened. I'm happy to say we did sell the movie rights. Although it's touchy because people in Hollywood do not want to make a movie about their fellow CEOs. So we'll see if that ever happens. But no, George is still out there spotting UFOs. Sydney and Manuela, with their $175 million, are now quote-unquote philanthropists. And people seem quite happy to take their money. In fact, Sydney is on the board of something at UCLA, and it was the most preposterous biography they had on their website. And I called them up and I said, "Has anybody fact-checked this?" And they said, "No, we just accepted, whatever she said." Of course, there's no mention of Sumner Redstone in there. Sherry is still the chairman of Paramount. Paramount is still, they're all struggling with the streaming problems. She did succeed in combining Viacom and CBS into what's now Paramount. But no, it's they're all still out there.
Let's open it up to questions. Who has the microphone? If you've been at other sessions, you know the rules. Stand if you are able. Make it a question, not a statement. All right, go ahead.
First, thanks for being here.
Yeah, pleasure.
As a trained lawyer, I'm curious about whether or not you had to wrestle your conscience about the whole notion of the source and the abrogation of the attorney-client privilege that was a treasure trove, as I think you described it.
Yes. That's the short answer. I was acute. I knew the identity of the source, obviously, from the very beginning, and I was acutely aware of what she was doing and why. I never asked her to do that. I would never do that. I have never asked anyone to breach either a legal or fiduciary obligation to give me information. This was a situation where she came to us. She volunteered it, she gave it to Rachel, and we were extremely careful never to ask her, never to induce her to do something that was not going to be in her best interest. But I am a journalist. My duty is to readers and to provide information, and I couldn't let my admitted personal concern for her, I think, outweigh the value of what she was providing and the need, I think, for readers to see this information. If you want to listen to the daily episode about her, it's worth listening to. It's very poignant. She says now that if she had to do all over again, she thinks she probably would not have done it. Oh. And that weighs on me, but she did it she didn't get any personal gain out of this. She did it for what she thought were reasons that overrode her professional obligation, and I respected that then and now.
Thank you so much. As a gal of Massachusetts, I see that his father was born in Massachusetts. He's buried in Sharon.
Yes,
and
right.
He changed his name from Rothstein to Redstone, which
yes.
is. I'm curious the family element here. Redstone inherited his father's, or went in business with his dad, and then his daughter then went into business with him. I'm just sort of curious the succession element of this multi-generationally, and to what extent is it cultural to that family, or what did you see in the sort of multi-gen business handoff?
Well, that is an interesting dimension of this, and you mentioned Succession. A lot of people think Succession was based on the Murdochs. I think there is some of the Murdochs in there, but there's a lot of the Redstones in there, particularly the daughter. The Sumner took over what was a family business, yes, but it was basically 2 drive-in movie theaters. And Sumner made it into a multi-billion-dollar media corporation. He was a brilliant business person. He could be ruthless, but he was incredibly hardworking, ambitious. You do see that in the book. A family element that I did find very interesting, that people sort of wonder, like, why was Sumner acting out with these women so late in his life? His mother would never let him have a date in high school. And any woman he ever brought, she dismissed as being inadequate. So there's a dynamic. Again, I'm not a psychologist, but I can imagine that weighed on him later in his life. I think it was always assumed that 2 children would be in the family business, and they were. I mean, obviously, the son, who did work briefly as a prosecutor, he was a lawyer, should never have gone into the family. But he should have gotten as far away from the family business as possible. But I think they were under intense pressure to, follow in the father's footsteps. But they were then, unfortunately, in this position where he would undermine and belittle them at every opportunity. But again, I'm not a psychologist, I can't really go into that. But the family dynamic is very potent, and I believe Succession did pick up on that. I didn't watch Succession until I finished the book. I knew there were similarities, and I didn't want subliminally to in any way be influenced. But you do see in the Roy family, the father constantly building up the children and then pulling the rug out from under them. So the drama never ends. It's never resolved. The suspense is hanging out there. Who's in, who's out, who do he love, who doesn't he? Is this going to change? Goes on constantly. And he's very competitive with the children, which I think is straight out of the Redstone saga.
So I was just curious whether your next book is about the Robert Maxwell family. He's the UK equivalent of Sumner Redstone.
Well,
And the other question I had is, do you have the T-shirts?
No, I do not have the spam T-shirts. But I think Marv is one of those people who thinks if you can give somebody something, then they're going to owe you back. So he's an avid bridge player, and I once mentioned in passing that I had played bridge in college. I wouldn't even know how to start bidding now, but he sent me a slew of how-to books on bridge, unsolicited by me. The Maxwell family, I am thinking about another book, and I can't really say. I'm negotiating or discussing with a key source who I hope will cooperate. I have written about the Maxwells before, and then, of course, as you probably know, the daughter, Ghislaine Maxwell, became the companion of Jeffrey Epstein. I've written a lot about Jeffrey Epstein. That's a whole other saga, believe me. You want to talk about sordid behavior, I will say a problem with a story like that is I've gone to some dark places in my work, but do I want to spend 2 or 3 years in the world of Jeffrey Epstein? That's a tough threshold to get over, frankly.
Actually, my wife inspired this question, but it's obvious, I think. You paint, I read the book now, you paint the picture of Leslie Moonves going through, leading a boardroom revolt. At the same time, he's being pilloried by over a dozen women that he's abused. Did the parallel ever occur to you between that story and Donald Trump right now? And could there be a book in that one too?
Well, okay, I've written kind of 2 political books. I wrote Bloodsport about the Clintons, and I'm not a partisan person myself at all. I'm interested in why people do things. I'm not here to judge them. That's something I could say as well. As a writer, I want the reader to be the judges. I want to give them the information and empower them to judge. I am not here to pass judgment on people. But I did write the Clinton book, and there was a lot in there that Clinton people did like. There was a lot that Clinton people did not like, and the reaction was so unlike anything I've ever gone through. I was saying earlier, I was speaking at Politics and Prose in Washington, D.C. when somebody attacked me on the stand, and the guard, he literally got his hands on me, and the guard had to come haul him away. The partisan reaction to that was pretty extreme, and that was back then. And then I did a book on the the whole, FBI crossfire, it wasn't really about the Russia thing, but the whole Comey thing called Deep State. And that was so nasty also that I sort of had said, I'm not doing any more political books. I'm going to leave that to somebody else. At least at this point in my life, I think I just don't. If it's a really great story, of course, never say never, I do it. But no, there are plenty of other people who can write that.
Thank you. Quick question. Did you speak to the family at all, and has Sherry Redstone been in touch with you?
Yes, I did speak to the family. I spoke to some of the children. I spoke to Sherry. Initially, Sherry did not want to be identified as a source, but at the very end, in the notes, she did allow me to say that she had participated in the reporting, so that's in the notes. And I have heard from her since. She said much of it was too painful for her to read, but she thought it was a very fair and honest account, which I took as high praise. We haven't gotten together, but we've been emailing back and forth saying, oh, let's have lunch, or, when we got a few minutes here or something. And I like Sherry. Well, I went to see her. She has a house in Connecticut, and I drove out there, and no gate, no armed guard, nothing, just a driveway. And it's a very nice house, and it's right on Long Island Sound with a nice view. But I'm telling you, you have much bigger and more beautiful houses right out here. And she had made a chocolate chip cake of some kind that she'd baked herself. And I thought, wow, isn't that nice? Here she is, a billionaire mogul, and she made a chocolate chip cake. It was a little sweet for my taste, but I was very touched by it. Thank you. Thank you.
In the media business, you obviously don't need to make this stuff up. Thank you so much, James B. Stewart, Autumn Phillips. So appreciate your being here, Jim. Thank you again to 20 South Battery and Dr. Jack Schaefer, and thank you so much to all of you. Jim will be signing books out in the lobby where the box office is. Thank you.